Demakes are really fun. Taking a game and finding the essence of it and reinterpreting it to run on previous generation hardware is such a fascinating process. It really teases out what makes that game that game. It's amazing to see what fans have done with different IP and games these days, but Nintendo was no stranger to the concept, especially back in the Game Boy days. See, the Game Boy came out in the 80s and lasted all the way up until the early 2000s, and it was wild what they were able to do with some of the most basic underpowered hardware out there. I mean, even the Game Boy Color was just barely a step up from Game Boy. In fact, Nintendo considers them the same generation. And all of this culminated when Nintendo took Donkey Kong Country, one of the most graphically intense Super Nintendo games, one using pre-rendered 3D that looked so good people thought it might be the Nintendo 64 when it was first previewed, and put it all on the Game Boy Color just a few years later. Nintendo was so busy asking if it could, it didn't really stop and ask if it should. So, how did Donkey Kong Country on the Game Boy Color turn out? Well, it's actually really impressive. I mean, the whole game is on here. Like every single level, every bonus stage, everything. They even expanded a few levels, like Winky's Walkway is restored. They added an extra level, and yeah, it's a lot of content on a little Game Boy Color cartridge. But even as impressive of a technical achievement that this game is it any fun to play? Is there any reason why anybody should revisit it today? I mean, back in the day, this was the only way that you're going to get Donkey Kong Country on the go. But today, any emulator machine can play Donkey Kong Country on the Super Nintendo. So is there a reason to revisit this game? Well, let's dive in. By 2000, the nearly decade-old Super Nintendo was no longer cutting edge. It was a 16-bit system to output a standard definition signal with tens of thousands of colors. It could still hold its own with sprite-based games, but it had long been left in the dust when it came to 3D graphics that were all the rage at this time. The Game Boy Color? Well, this thing was a barely enhanced version of the already ancient Game Boy, which was considered underpowered out of the gate in the 80s. An 8-bit system with a tiny resolution of 160 by 144 pixels with limited color and sprite capabilities, the Game Boy Color wheezed in with a feature set that barely made it competitive with the, by this point, already ancient Game Gear. But Nintendo is not one to be fazed by the hardware limitations of mere mortals. When Rare and Nintendo decided to put Donkey Kong Country on a portable system, dang it, they were gonna do it. Back in the 90s, the first attempt would be an original series running parallel to Donkey Kong Country, the Donkey Kong Land series for the monochromatic Game Boy. The intricate detail of Donkey Kong Land made the games almost incomprehensible on those screens, but the original levels and concepts still made them must-plays for kids like me who were obsessed with all things Donkey Kong Country. Donkey Kong Country for the Game Boy Color lands in a crossroads then, where the steadily improving Donkey Kong Land games plus the new Game Boy Color, that portable version of Donkey Kong could make the jump from land to country. But I don't know, the tech just wasn't really quite there yet. Just a few short years later, Donkey Kong Country would come out for the Game Boy Advance, and that would be a far superior port thanks to the Game Boy Advance's vastly better hardware capabilities. But today, we're here for that Game Boy Color version. So how's it look? Let's start with the obvious, the graphics. Booting up the game, this is going to be the first thing you notice when comparing this version of the game to Donkey Kong Country on the Super Nintendo. Yep, there's a huge loss in detail, which is painfully obvious in larger screens due to that very low Game Boy Color resolutions. But if you look at the unlit tiny screen of a genuine Game Boy Color, it's much easier to appreciate how much they're able to approximate the Super Nintendo on that tiny thing. Everything's just, a demake version of what came before. But it's not perfect. Most jarring is the lack of animation frames compared to the silky smooth pre-rendered sprites of the Super Nintendo Donkey Kong Country. Not that that would be possible on such low-powered hardware, but it does really make you feel how much of a demake this is in the movement. Some animations happen way too fast because of missing frames, and some move way too slow. For instance, a barrel throw or a barrel turn. Visually, the fact that most sprites only have two colors also stands out like a sore thumb and just gives away how limited this hardware is. You can really feel it groaning under the weight of this presentation. Despite that, There is impressively little slowdown, only happening when you're trying to throw a barrel while there are a bunch of sprites on screen at once, or if there's just simply too many things going on, like in some bonus games. However, there is a ton of flickering all the time, and that's just part of the Game Boy Color. This has always been a problem with the Donkey Kong Land games, and it's still an issue here. So we talked about how it looks. Let's talk about how it plays. So for the Donkey Kong Land Game Boy games, physics were the biggest problem, but they did get better as the series went on. This game builds off the physics engine of Donkey Kong Land 3, which was great as far as the Game Boy went. But it just absolutely blows compared to the incredible intuitive movement of the Super Nintendo Donkey Kong Country. The Game Boy Advance game would get much closer to that feeling. Your Kong has way less forward momentum when jumping. If in the original Super Nintendo Donkey Kong Country you jumped, you made a graceful arc while still staying in control of your descent. In Donkey Kong Country for the Game Boy Color, your jump forward is kind of hobbled and you sink like a stone. This makes it very difficult to clear gaps, especially since these gaps were originally designed with the Super Nintendo. Credit where credit is due, they did make changes and tweaks to make navigation possible, but man, it's still hard. You're going to need to get really good at rolling off a ledge and jumping in midair, because that's the most reliable way of getting across these gaps. The barrel levels suffer the most, with precise timing being completely thrown out the window by a combination of reaction lag, slow animations, and also animation lag. The multi-barrel chains required in Treetop are hilariously awful in this version and might drive you a little crazy. So let's talk about the music a little bit. You're going to get some serious deja vu with the soundtrack to this game, as it literally lifts many tracks directly from Donkey Kong Land. It's not the worst thing anymore, as the Donkey Kong Land soundtrack is one of the Game Boy's best. I would have loved to have a little more variation though, and it's sometimes jarring to hear different levels get the wrong music. For instance, the Slipside Ride level music is in all the snow zones, while Slipside Ride itself has water temple music from Donkey Kong Land, and it messes with your head a little bit when you know Donkey Kong Country so well. There are a ton of fun little details and changes in this game. For instance, I love the nighttime theme of one of the temple levels, making everything blue instead of yellow. I already mentioned that Winky's walkway is restored to its full version. You may have noticed in the Super Nintendo version of Donkey Kong Country that it's kind of short, and it's, made into a normal level here. The other thing that they have is a bonus level, and let's talk about that. So, Necky's Nutmare isn't amazing, and the name is beyond dreadful, but it's a fun challenge, especially with Necky killing you while crawling through tunnels. There are places where it looks a bit janky and stitched together, but overall, I'm glad this level is here. I just wish there were more of these levels. It's actually pretty cool that this game has a bonus level, and it's something I wish game remakes would do more often. If you've gone through all the work to remake the original game engine and rebuild it for a new format, why not give the fans of the games more levels to play through? Pitch black moments in a later factory level are hilariously easy to see through on a modern screen, but remember, this was made for a handheld with no backlight at all. Playing literally any level on original Game Boy Color or first gen Game Boy Advance was a challenge just to see what the heck was going on. Also, just FYI, to give you a heads up, the end screen features one of the most uncomfortable images the Game Boy Color screen has ever had the misfortune of displaying. I had to see it, and now you had to as well. If you're like me and you played Donkey Kong Country on the Super Nintendo to absolute death, then Donkey Kong Country on the Game Boy Color is kind of like a fun challenge mode. It takes everything you love about the game and changes it slightly. You see the graphics in a whole new light. You get to have the gameplay tweaked slightly, and everything's just a little harder. I have the minecart levels memorized at this point. I can do them blindfolded, but in this version of the game, it took me so many tries to beat those levels, and it was really fun being able to play kind of with fresh eyes again. So if you somehow haven't played Donkey Kong Country at all, start with the Super Nintendo version. There's a million places you can play it, including on the Nintendo Switch. But if you've mastered this game and you're really looking for something new, well, there's always Donkey Kong Country on the Game Boy Color to give you a nightmare.